This is Your Anxiety Toolkit, episode number 142. Welcome to Your Anxiety Toolkit. I'm your host, Kimberly Quinlan. This podcast is fueled by three main goals. The first goal is to provide you with some extra tools to help you manage your anxiety. Second goal, to inspire you. Anxiety doesn't get to decide how you live your life. And number three, and I leave the best for last, is to provide you with one big, fat virtual hug. Because experiencing anxiety ain't easy. If that sounds good to you, let's go. Welcome back, everybody. We're still taking breaths, and I know you are too. It's been tough, hasn't it? It's been tough. I know I did a whole episode about the coronavirus last week, and I hope if you haven't listened to it, go back and just hear my thoughts, and I give you a couple of my favorite tools to manage anxiety and uncertainty. And this week, I was scrambling actually to figure out what I wanted to talk about. And what kept ringing to me is I just wanted something that came from the heart, something that was rich, something that was empowering, and just human, maybe just a little not related to coronavirus. And it dawned on me that I had this amazing interview that I did about a month ago, ready to go. And I cannot tell you how excited I am now. As soon as I saw it, I was like, that's perfect. That's exactly the message I want to give. So today we have the amazing Jon Lupin, and he is here to spread his incredible, I can't even put it into words, his amazing ability to put words down on a paper and make it beautiful and romantic and heartbreaking and all the feels. I just love the work that he does. Now, Jon Lupin is a poet. He is the poet behind the Instagram handle, The Poetry Bandit. You should go and check it out. It is back-to-back beauty. And I really was so excited when he agreed to do this episode. I was so excited to share with him my favorite poems that he has written. I have all of the books that he has written, and I'm a big fan. So, again, just really feel like maybe this is a message you wanted to hear, a story. This is like I did a hard thing, as we're all doing a hard thing this week. So I'm going to let you listen to that. And if you can lose yourself in the conversation and give yourself a little break from all the things coronavirus, maybe that will heal you a little. Maybe that will give you a moment of peace and a moment of inspiration. So there it is. I'm so excited to share this episode with you. Before I do, I just wanted to share with you one poem that I didn't feature in the conversation we had, but I wanted to say this particularly because it was so perfect for the time. And it goes like this. She could be bruised. She could be cut. She could bleed. She could be put under a broken world, and still she would heal, dust herself off, and tell you she will be okay, because she is built of tougher stuff. You guys, that's you. Whether you, again, the pronoun here is he, she, they, whichever applies to you, there it is, right? We're built of tougher stuff. We will get through this. And so I'm sending you my love. Really, I am. Please do go to CBT School. There is free resources there, and there is a free download called RAIN, and it's there for you if you want some help and a free resource to help you manage anxiety and uncertainty during this difficult time. And it's all related to coronavirus. So there that is. And have a great week. I'm sending you my love and enjoy this amazing interview.
Well, welcome. I am actually very honored to have with us here Jon Lupin, who is also known as the Poetry Bandit, with us today. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me, Kim.
Okay, so this is actually particularly very exciting for me. I'll tell you a little backstory is I have always wanted to be a poet. It's something that I think that if my mental health had have allowed it, I would have actually gone in that direction myself. So this is actually really like touching for me to sort of delve into this topic, which I haven't really had in my life yet.
That's awesome.
Yeah. So tell us about your poetry journey and about your history and what you're wanting to share with us today.
For sure. First of all, thanks for having me. I've been following you and one of your friends, Mindfire OCD, for a while. And the last couple of years has really helped me on my journey. And so I've always been a writer. And it was always kind of how I process my feelings. My dad was a folk artist in the 70s. So I kind of like fell into the whole singer-songwriter thing at a young age. So I've always kind of written poetry in a song format. And as life kind of carried on, I ventured into all different kinds of writing. I went to university for an English literature degree. I thought I was going to teach English, and then I realized I didn't want to teach people who thought they were going to be smarter than me. I remember looking around the room in one of my English classes, looking at everybody dressed like Jesus, thinking, these people think they know more than the professor. Like, I don't know if I can handle this. So I just kind of kept on in the insurance industry, which is still my job today. So yeah, so I have OCD and I work in insurance. So it's like, sometimes it's like pouring gasoline on a forest fire.
Right. I can understand that. A lot of people who have those jobs that require exactness, it makes it very hard.
Yeah, it can be pretty stressful, but it's a rewarding industry. And I stayed in it because I was good at it. I was good at the relationship part of it. And I was a people person, and I liked that about it. And I could control risk to a certain degree and help people do that and educate them. And that's kind of why I stayed in it and just kept on with my English literature degree. And because I enjoyed writing as a side thing, but I never would have considered myself a poet. So when I got into more of the corporate life, I stopped writing for a long time. I stopped playing guitar. I stopped writing poetry for my wife at the time. I stopped all sorts of stuff and just focused on, sliding into that role of being the caregiver and, the breadwinner and all that kind of crap. So, I had started a winery insurance program for the company I was working for at the time. And in short order, I had probably 90% of the marketplace locked up. And I was really good at that space. And people would give me wine. And it was perfect for someone like me because I was falling into this predisposed role of becoming an alcoholic because it's a family disease, and it just kind of took over when stress became too much. I couldn't really decide at one point in my past where I decided like I was just going to go full bore into drinking, but it just kind of happened. I didn't wake up one morning going, I'm going to be an alcoholic. Like, it's just not how it works. So, I was high functioning. I had a great job. I had 3 kids at the time. I had a house and I had cars and I was paying bills and little to no debt. And, things were great. So I thought. And so as I kind of went along in this corporate role, I became director of sales, and I was drinking. At that point, I realized at some point in 2014, I was like, wow, I'm drinking every day. And I'm not drinking just like a couple of glasses of wine. I'm drinking a couple of bottles of wine every day. So never once did I think about that, though. I was, once in a while I'd be like, oh, yeah, I should probably slow down or whatever. But there was always something going on. There was always something to celebrate. There was always some deal that was going on. Like, it was, at some point it was just crazy. And I would crash cars and I would disappear and I'd black out. And these were things that wasn't me. That was not me. And then just sort of fast forward through my story a bit. In 2014, I decided I would try and get sober. At one point, I came home and my wife at the time said, you have to quit drinking the way you're drinking. You have to figure this out because this isn't, I'm not willing to wait up for you anymore or wonder if you're dead or whatever. So I said, okay. I remember clearly what I had come home and I was in my suit and I had a piece of pizza in my pocket. I had no idea how that pizza got there. And I had just come back from a blackout drunk in the city. So I remember telling her that I would quit drinking the next day, and that lasted a week. And I just kept relapsing. Like I never made a full effort or to discover why I couldn't say no to the alcohol. So a whole year went by of me relapsing. But around this time, when I was trying to get sober, she came home with a typewriter, and she said, I think we should give this a shot. Like let's fill our time in the evening with something a little more productive than drinking. And so around that time, she started typing and sharing and using an acronym or a pseudonym at the time as a name on Instagram. And I was like, it seems like she's having fun and it's working for her, because she was working through her own stuff as well. We had a couple of miscarriages between our second and our third child, and she had just weaned that child, our last child, and she had gone through some major struggles of her own. And she was coming out the other side, and I was just starting my journey of trying to figure out why I couldn't say no to drinking. And I would lay on the couch and I would throw myself a pity party, and I would whine and complain, and I would do anything and trying to manipulate her in any way that I could to let me go out and buy some alcohol. And most nights she wouldn't have it, but one day she came home with this typewriter and said, why don't you give this a shot? And you used to write all the time. Why don't you get back into it, right? So I said, you do the typewriter thing. I'm going to do my own thing. And so I would just write something over a picture, and then I would post it. And at the time I called myself the hopeless loser. And so if you check that hashtag, you can actually find a few poems of mine from 2014 that are still floating around. And I had some people say, and I was very open about my struggle with alcoholism at the time. And I had figured, okay, I'm an alcoholic, and because it was so hard to say no. And so I had a few people reach out to me and say, hey, I'm struggling as well. I don't know why I'm having such a hard time quitting. And some of those people I'm still friends with today. And I had a couple of people say to me, hey, your name is part of the problem. Like, you're not hopeless and you're not a loser. So I changed it to the Poetry Bandit, because I figured this is the time when I'm going to steal my love of writing back from my addiction. And so that's where the name comes from. And for, a whole 6 to 8 months or so, I still struggled to stay sober until I went to a recovery program. And July 29th, 2015 was my last drink. Following that, then the real challenge came when I had to confront the reason why I was drinking. Because as an alcoholic, I believe that it's not the alcohol that's the problem. It's what's going on in the background, what's going on in my brain that's bringing me there, right? So, my solution at the time was alcohol. So now that I didn't have a solution to my problem, it was like, okay, well, what's my problem? Why was I so obsessive about drinking? And yeah, I was drinking up to 3 bottles of wine a day before I quit. Like, it was really bad at that point. But I never brown bagged it. I didn't lose anything. I never drank in the morning. I didn't hide alcohol. Like, those weren't part of my alcoholism. So I always figured I wasn't one. But when I eventually went to this recovery program, I had to admit that I was powerless against it. And that's when everything kind of flooded over me like, holy crap, I'm just like my uncles and just like my grandfather, right? So who are, all sober, but they struggled with it as well. And so as I began to be left alone with my thoughts, and I would write and I would do the Poetry Bandit thing still, there were parts of my relationship with my wife at the time that highlighted the fact that I was very dependent and suspicious and like obsessive about what she was doing with her time. And it was very abnormal. And then I would then take that obsession, and then when I would leave the house, I would put that on other things. Like, there's a white van in the street. What's in that white van? And at some point, I was actually opening up people's vehicles to see if there were children inside, or I would follow a van going, oh, there could be somebody kidnapped in there. Like, it got really bad. And I didn't know where this was coming from. And it didn't take me long to figure out this is what I had been repressing through drinking for all this time, was this desire, this burning desire to control everything around me. And I found that the more television I watched, the worse it got, right? So if I watched CSI, or if I watched the news, or if I spent too much time on Facebook, like this would be terrible the next day. Like I wouldn't be able to focus on my job or what I was doing. I would be obsessed with what was going on out there. So I went to the doctor and we did the tests, right? Here in Canada, you do this test that he will score you out of 42. And I scored 39 out of 42. And he was like, whoa, okay, maybe we should look at some medication for you. And so he put me on Cipralex, and that was a disaster. Like it did not work for me at all. So I weaned myself off and said, forget it. So I continued on in my sobriety without any medication, but it was really taking a toll on my relationship with my wife at the time. And I wouldn't let the kids go outside sometimes. And, I was just trying to keep everything and everybody around me in this tight grasp where I could just make sure that nothing bad was going to happen, right? And hyper focused on what my ex-wife was doing with her phone and where she was going and who she was hanging out with. And it was maddening. Like I don't think it ever brought me any ounce of happiness to know, where she was going or whatever. It would just invite even more scenarios that would drive me nuts. So at one point in the summer of 2017, I was 2 years sober. I was ready to just end it, either go out and just drink myself into a ditch somewhere or just jump in front of the next nearest truck that was going to be driving by, because it just drove me crazy. I couldn't concentrate on anything other than all of the things that could eventually give me a problem. And so I called my sponsor up in my program, and I didn't make a plan, but I had thoughts, right? Suicidal thoughts, but I never made a plan. But he talked me back into, coming to a meeting and doing a few other things. And it was just nice to have someone to talk to. And he didn't understand what I was going through, but he did understand that I was an alcoholic and that the last thing I needed to do was to drink about it. So he encouraged me to go back to the doctor. So I did. I went back to my doctor, and he prescribed me a medication called Trintellix. And so I was on 10 milligrams for about a year before I realized that it had made all the difference for me. And we did another test after being on that med for about a year. So in 2018, I did the test again, and I scored like a 5 out of 32. But along with that medication I was going to therapy as well. So it did a few things alongside of the medication. So that was prescribed to me to do more than just take the med. Exercise, go to therapy, learn some coping mechanisms, all that kind of stuff. And so that's what I did. And now I'm on 7.5 milligrams. And, I don't think it's in remission, but doctor's happy with where I'm at. But the one thing I did do, like in addition to the therapy, in addition to the medication, was write about it, be more vulnerable about it. So I redid my Sober Little Moon in 2018 and got really vulnerable about what this OCD was for me without exposing my ex's issues or, what we were going through. On the surface, everybody thought things were going fine. And, writing just sort of brought a little bit of peace in between each obsessive thought. And when I was on the medication, it kind of just, I did a lot of reposting because the creativity kind of went away. And I thought, okay, well, that's a bit of a sacrifice I need to make for some peace of mind. But every time I'd repost, I'd be like, oh, okay. So it would open up a door and I would go, oh, yeah, okay, I remember why I wrote that. And that's all part of my OCD.
Right. I would love if you would. Would you be willing to share some of them?
Absolutely.
Okay. So for those who are listening, I actually had spoken with Jon about this and sort of picked out the ones that I absolutely fell in love with, which is pretty much every single one. If you can see, like, look at the tabs here.
Oh my goodness.
I'm like, there's one. Yes, there's another one. I just love them. I think you have a beautiful talent of speaking to a subject, but somehow I think everyone would be able to relate in some way, even
Right.
if they're not going. You're incredibly talented. Incredibly.
Oh.
So would you share OCD part 2?
Sure. So OCD part 2 is on page 106 of my first book, which is called My Sober Little Moon. And that was a book I wrote. I wrote most of the poems. First half of the book I wrote when I was trying to get sober. And the second half is I wrote when I did get sober, and republished it in 2018. And so it's there, OCD part 2. I have to admit, I never saw any of this becoming part of my reality. To know that my fear and worry has finally found a period instead of a comma. Well, that is like manna, my friends, bread from heaven to soak in oil instead of tears. Like a last meal on your last day, but knowing that the hangman isn't coming because his grandmother passed away from natural causes. And he isn't coming back because she left him a lot of money and a boat to sail around the Caribbean in. Freedom of some sort is what I have realized that I am afforded now because of some tiny little orange pill that I must take with food each morning with a half glass of orange juice at exactly 7:34 a.m. after I eat a bowl of fiber-rich cereal and a cup of almond milk, and not before or after, because if I take it later, I get really tired at 1:13 p.m. But this, my friends, is more beautiful to me than any eclipse of a moon, a sun, or a heart. I have OCD, and I take a medication to manage it, and I'm pretty damn proud of that.
I love it.
Yeah, you can kind of see how some of my obsessive thinking is kind of like it's woven into, like, you know, where's the hangman and why didn't he show up and what is he doing? And when I have to take my medication, sometimes that's a stream of consciousness I often have about things, right?
Right, right. And I really love that. And I think that's where the hangman is the word that really strung to me, because I feel like so many of my clients have reported like it's like a hangman, right? Like waiting. So I really resonated with that. Thank you for sharing it.
No problem.
Would you mind sharing, okay, of all, this one is my favorite, the imperfect, mainly because I feel like this speaks to everybody. I mean, it's just so beautifully done. So would you share that as well?
Absolutely. I can't exactly remember what I was going through at the time when I wrote this one, but it kind of sums up a lot of what was happening in my marriage at the time. Okay, so imperfect on page 28 of My Sober Little Moon. I can see that it's killing you. You want to turn to the last page in my story just to see the look on my face when you tell me you weren't lying, that you meant it when you said this would all come crashing down upon my house, like a diseased oak tired from the battering rams of the wind. Well, go ahead. Turn ahead. You'll miss all the good parts in between. As for the ending, well, you see that is how I've changed. I have no interest in knowing how it ends for me. I've let that go. But if you want to follow me through the story, take off your white sheet, your coward's cloak, and put on some rubber boots, because it's going to get messy. Nothing is perfect, and it was never supposed to be. Ghosts can't pray anyway, so please stay with me. Just shut up and hold my hand.
Mm. What comes up for you? Like, can you share with us a little bit of that story?
Yeah, absolutely. Now that I read it, I kind of remember what was going through my mind at the time. So response to mental health in a church community is something that needs to be improved in a big way. So I've grown up in a church community here in Canada, and people's ability to, like, when you tell someone that you're struggling with something, it was the response was like, oh, wow, okay, we'll pray for you. Like, sorry, that just doesn't cut it. Like, you can't say you'll pray for me and then ghost me for the next 4 years and then finally come up to me and go, hey, how's it going? Like, go away, right? So that's what this is about. It's about people being too cowardly to approach a subject like mental health, like OCD, like alcoholism, like addiction, and have a meaningful response to it. Like, All I asked you to do was walk alongside me. I didn't ask you to make me sober. I didn't ask you to solve my problem with alcohol. I didn't ask you to solve my problem with OCD. I just asked you to hold my hand, right? Just put on some rubber boots and walk through the mud with me. That's all. But, the response was, they oftentimes I would have friends, they would say, like, we just don't know how to relate to you anymore. And I said, well, go to Al-Anon, do some reading on OCD. Like, all of that is your responsibility. It's not my responsibility to make you understand what I'm going through on a deeper level. You can do the reading. You can go to Al-Anon. You can figure out what, you need to do to help me. It is not my job to control you, but that is exactly what I'm trying to give up. It's your responsibility as my friend, as my family member, as my fellow churchgoer, to figure out how you can help, and then come to me and ask, what can I do for you today? Not just sort of keep it at, if you're going to pray for me, that's great. Go for it. Sometimes, that's all some people can do. But if you're on a deeper level with me before all this happens and then you disappear, like, I don't know what that's about, because that doesn't align with any part of what we were before all this happened. So I'm not saying I'm perfect, and I'm not saying the friendship was perfect. I'm not saying that anything else was perfect. It's all imperfect, and that's okay. It doesn't have to be perfect for you to make sense of it all, right? You can walk alongside me in total imperfectness and just let it be that. Like, if things have to be perfect for you and me to interact, then I'm sorry, I don't think we're going to be good friends anymore.
Right. Yeah. And it's funny because as I read both of these amazing books, and I know there is a third, right?
Yeah.
I mean, just for me to reflect, all of these are about this sort of deep romance, not just with like a lover, but like friendship, and like, come stand by me, and the pain of not being respected or and so forth. So was that sort of is that a part of it, or was that my interpretation?
Oh, no, you've nailed it for sure. Like, I think the struggle that I've had with people in my church community is to understand things from a poetic point of view. And yeah, I get it. Poetry is not for everybody. And a lot of people just do not bother. Like, I have very, very good friends that have never talked to me about any of my writing or have read any of my books at all. And it boggles my mind. Like, if one of my best friends wrote a book, I would be the first one to read it and comment and write a review. And I didn't get any of that kind of support at the beginning. But to be fair, for 3 years, I didn't tell anybody I was the Poetry Bandit. I kept it all to myself because I was afraid of judgment. I was afraid of how it would be received. And then when I got my publishing deal from Macmillan to do You Only Love Me When I'm Suffering, an Encyclopedia of a Broken Heart, I made it public. And then the response I received was, overwhelming. And it was primarily of support. But still, there's this gap between the next step, right? The next step to understanding what it is that I went through. So it's still a lot of avoidance, I guess, is what I would call it. And I'm not the kind of person now that just would let it go. So, I'm a little more public and a little more outspoken now about, this could have gone differently. This could have gone better, right? I could have done things differently, and definitely people around me could have responded differently. But I can say for a fact that my family has always been very supportive and very responsive. And I've got two best friends that have been sort of, they've gone through their own stuff, but for the most part have been supportive as well. But again, poetry is not for everybody. So when they see poetry, they go, well, I don't read poetry. And it's kind of like, well, it's poetry written by me, right? Like, we know each other. Like, I don't understand why you haven't read any of my books. So it just boggles my mind sometimes that the support is, I'm not going to say lackluster, but just hasn't been there to a certain degree.
Why do you think that is? Like, what's your opinion on, like, you've even shared here, and so much of your writing is telling us about the messy middle, right?
Yeah.
Not the beginning story, but not the final, just glossy ending, but like this messy middle. It's so beautiful. Why do you think people have a hard time with that? While also, obviously, with your amazing following in these books, some people are really drawn to it.
Yeah. I've thought about that a lot actually in the last year or so, especially since now I'm separated from my wife of 14 years and we have a very amicable relationship. And that even freaks people out too. Like they don't know what to do with an amicable divorce. Like you guys are co-parenting. I don't get it. Like you guys should be fighting. It's a lot easier for me to make sense of this if you're fighting like everybody else does, right? But yeah, so when I got sober, people had no idea how to relate to me, but I gave them a solution. Go to Al-Anon, like go to some meetings. They'll teach you how to relate to the alcoholic who's still suffering or trying to get sober. No, we'll just pray about it. Or no, I don't want to sit in a group and talk to people about my feelings. All right. Okay. Well, I've given you a solution and you've decided not to do it. So that's fine. Some people responded really well. Like my brother did a lot of talking to me. He tried to understand. Others not so much. And I don't know why until now. I have figured out that people just haven't been trained. It's not their fault that they don't know what to do with it. So we're all products of our parenting and our upbringing. And even though some of my friends have come from very loving families and very educated families, when they were faced with this, they still didn't know what to do. And so I think church communities, schools, even private schools, public schools, it doesn't matter. Like back 20 years ago, 90s and early 2000s, people just still weren't talking about this, right? So people my age, like 40s, late 30s, early 40s, still, they don't know what to do with it. They just don't. And they're afraid to go outside of their bubble to get information about it because they think that information is tainted, right? So if you go outside the church to get information about OCD, mental health, alcoholism, it's tainted because Jesus isn't mentioned in it. And that's the major problem, is that if that's the way you are and you're unwilling to trust science or psychologists or psychiatrists or therapists or counselors, life coaches, people who study this stuff, then yeah, there's always going to be a disconnect between you being able to help people who are going through mental health issues or addiction, right? So you have to broaden the way that you look at things, the way that you understand them beyond just what's in the Bible, right? And that's a big thing for my OCD, is getting away from superstition that's based in religion and seeing things more clearly without treating God like a magic wish maker, right? Or because that actually made my magical thinking even worse. And that was a struggle for me to just look at things a little more, I don't know, the way that my therapist has been teaching me to look at things, right? So, but yeah, people they're just not equipped. And how do we change that, right? The only way that I thought that things would change is if somebody actually stood up and got public about it and started saying things or writing poetry or challenging people to see who would rise to the cream of the crop as a person who would want to assist with change, right? Who would want to and it's happening, right? So like in my church community, there are good conversations happening. There are groups of people who know that things need to be changed, right? Because if we're going to help people outside on the street who are suffering with mental health disorders and find them a bed to sleep in and give them a blanket, we should be able to turn to our brother and sister in the church who are clearly struggling with the same issues and give them the same level of care. And if you can't do that, you shouldn't be going to church. Sorry, I said it. Boom, it's there. It's like hypocrisy at the greatest level, So, I mean, if you're going to give a homeless person a blanket, turn around to the guy who has already told the entire group of people surrounding him that he's struggling with alcohol or OCD or whatever it might be. The lady who says, I have bipolar, turn around and do something.
Right. I love that. I want to share something with you, and let me go off track here because I think, can I go to one of the poems? Because as you're talking about that, this is resonating so much with me. So in your Encyclopedia of a Broken Heart, you have the poem that's about okay. Can I read it?
Yeah, absolutely.
It says, it's just so perfect for what you're saying. You don't need anyone to tell you what to worry about. And you don't need anyone telling you to stop frowning, feeling, furrowing that brow. What you do need is to be told everything is that it's okay. And we love you no matter what.
Yeah. Yeah, I put that one in there because it was, I wrote Encyclopedia of a Broken Heart around this time last year, and it was published in October 2019. So a lot of what a lot of the basis for my poetry obviously comes from my journey, but also my ex-wife's journey, and our struggle with mental health is intertwined, so she was diagnosed with bipolar 2, and she's in remission for that today. But it was a long haul to get her there. And a lot of the time that I had spent in our relationship was taking care of her and taking care of our 3 kids and, going to doctor's meetings and therapy and trying to figure out how we can get her back to normal. And after we had 2 miscarriages between our second and our third child, after she had weaned our third child, she became a different person. She became withdrawn and more depressed, and it got worse and worse and worse. And eventually she would become a different person at certain times of the month or of the week or the day. It wouldn't matter. And the diagnosis changed a couple of times, and so did medication, and lots of crazy stuff happened in between. And yeah, eventually we found a perfect program of medication and exercise and getting her out of the house that kind of brought a lot of balance to her life. And I followed later, right? I was about 2 years behind her in terms of coming to terms with everything. So a lot of those poems come from both of us discussing, how do we interact with people around us? Like, we isolated for a long time. And I think that's part of why people kind of go, well, you guys kind of disappeared. And so we figured, you need some alone time. So there's one of the things that I talk about a lot with people is learning from my mistakes. Like, the worst thing I did was isolate the family from everyone else, because all it did was encourage other people not to help. So the more in the face of other people you are, in terms of like, we should have still invited people over, but it's really hard to do that when you're depressed, right? I mean, you will always have the mental illness thing to fall back on, and you look back and you go, well, you know what? It all happened for a reason. But people need to know it's okay to feel like that. It's okay to isolate to a certain degree, and for a time. Like, you need to, like, for me, I needed that time to, when I reflect back on it, and then I go, oh yeah, okay, so during that time I really felt like this, but now I feel like that, right? It's like, it's needed for balance. But I'm always careful now. Like, part of that poem is to let people know it's okay not to be okay. And I think that's a very popular message nowadays when we talk about mental health. But if it's okay not to be okay, what's the next step? Right? If you can get locked in that feeling, it's okay that I'm not okay. But then what? Right? We need that next step. We need to know that I'm still loved and I'm still important to you. Like, if people know that you're isolating, that's why we say check up on your friends, even though that seem to be doing okay. Right? So that's kind of what that poem is about. Like, just for people who are going through that, to remember that there are people out there who still love them. Right?
Would you share this one? I actually feel like is going to resonate with a lot of people. The poem called Chapel.
Oh yeah.
And so can you speak a little bit to what this was? What was going on for you when you wrote this?
Yeah, absolutely. So Chapel I wrote in the midst of relapsing many times during 2014. So 2014, I had started the writing, I had started the sharing, and Chapel was one of the very first pieces I ever wrote and shared on Instagram using my typewriter. And during that time, I had struggled. There was always a pity party going on in my head. And the amount of people in my head telling me I wasn't good enough, or I needed alcohol to be somebody, like, people will not want to hang out with you, like you're a loner, like without alcohol. Before I started drinking, I was bullied a lot in high school, right? Like, I was always felt lesser than, I was not a happy person. People made fun of my OCD, right? I liked things a certain way and I liked a clean apartment, and I would have friends come over and they would mess it up on purpose. And at the time that was funny, right? And I thought it was hilarious as well. Now I look back on it and I go, geez, I really did not like it, if I'm honest, right? But these are people that I love and they love me. But again, that's part of the issue, right? It's like, lack of education. And then I don't blame them. I don't have any resentments against them for it. But, I always look back on that and I go, well, maybe this is part of my problem is being obsessive compulsive about things. And so, I always knew I had OCD, and I always knew that there was stuff going on in my brain that I couldn't understand. And I always sort of likened it to a choir. So when I wrote Chapel, it kind of helped me understand what it was. And so this is Chapel. It's a short one. Page 113 of my Sober Little Moon. I have learned not to fight the voices in my head. So I built a chapel and made them my choir. So through writing that one, I kind of came to terms with the fact that there was something going on that I couldn't understand, but I wasn't going to let it beat me down. I was going to build a church and I would make them my choir, and I would tell them what to sing and what key to sing it in. And I sort of just embrace that, quote unquote, crazy part of myself and turn it to my benefit somehow. Right.
Right. And I mean, it's a perfect explanation of pretty much the whole work I do.
Yeah.
Right.
Exactly.
In a few lines. It's wonderful. Thank you for sharing that. Okay. I have one more I really want to get to.
Sure.
I mean, as you can see by the tabs, there's like 100. There was one thing that stood out so much. So, you do a beautiful job of like talking about mental illness, and even below that, just common human experiences, right?
Yeah.
Like, loss and grief and guilt and shame and all these things I think you write so beautifully about. And then out of nowhere, it shocked me, not that maybe it was where I was at the time, but you wrote this amazing poem about self-love, right?
Yeah.
And it sort of, I think it shifted me a little bit, because I could see how there was sort of like a rise in you, and it's saying, no, I have things to do. I have things I have to do. Can you share? It's a fairly long poem, so I won't expect you to read it, but can you share your message there?
Yeah. So when I wrote Self-Love, I was kind of like, I was frustrated with a few things going on, and like what I was reading a lot of on Instagram or in books about what self-love was being passed off as. And that's changed in recent months. We've seen a lot of what I echoed in this poem I wrote about a year ago, is that self-love is just not an isolation thing. And that's the part of it that drives me nuts, is that people go, well, let's get into the bathtub and drink a bottle of wine. Like, that's not self-love. I'm really sorry, but getting drunk is not self-love. It's destroying relationships. It destroys your body. Alcohol causes cancer. Like, I just don't understand why alcohol has to be part of self-love. It doesn't make any sense to me at all, considering where I've been with it, obviously. But there's a part of self-love that just, I don't know, like when I wrote it, I felt like something had to be said just slightly contrary to the whole concept of self-love. Something that made people think, because I think at the core of it is what I want to do is just slight disruptions to how people consider certain society, I don't know how to say that, but things that we just accept, right? Is that self-love is the most important part of any relationship. And to a certain degree, I believe that as well. But it's just more than that. Like, we can turn self-love into its own temple and then disregard every other part of our lives that needs constant attention. And so self-love has to be taken with a grain of salt. Like, I truly believe that. Like, it's not just about myself. Like, I affect so many people. My self-love can't involve disappearing into a bathtub. Like, that doesn't work for me. I have 3 children, which I share responsibilities with my ex-wife. I have a business to run. I have the gift of being multi-talented, so I can do those things and not feel like I'm being drained all the time. But if I would do that self-love thing that somebody tells me, well, you need to love yourself completely and wholly and do all this stuff and follow my 10-week program and spend all this money and walk through a million weeks of self-love and boundary setting and all that kind of stuff, I'm going to lose myself. I'm going to lose who I am. At the core of it, I love people. I love being around people. I love helping people. I love when people help me. Self-love, I think, is great, but I think at the core of it, if you can't love yourself, if you can't love other people while you're loving yourself, then there's something wrong with how you're viewing self-love. I don't get why people think that self-love has to be something that only involves yourself.
So you said here, and this is what I loved, it said, I think I'll get my affairs in order, find you, apologize, humble myself, and clean the slate. Because I feel only then will I be able to love myself.
Right. Yeah. So, yeah, and thanks for reminding me. That was the one part I forgot to talk about, was that I found self-love in clearing up my resentments. So in my program of recovery, it's really important to constantly address resentments that either I create or other people create against me, because resentment will lead to drinking at some point. I got to clear that up, which is why having an amicable divorce is the only way that, my ex and I can go through this process. Like in Canada, you can't file for divorce until a year after your separation. So you have a whole year to work through everything that has gone on between you. And I like that. I think that's good. Like other people say, wow, that's way too long, right? I'm like, well, there's a reason why it is the way it is. And it's perfect for me because, even though my ex and I have cleared up a lot of resentments, there's still stuff that will come up all the time. And I have the freedom, and she understands that I have the freedom to work through that right away. That's how I love myself, is by involving other people all the time and uncomfortable situations. Totally uncomfortable to walk into something and go, you know what? You really pissed me off 3 years ago. And I just want to say I'm sorry for my role in that. And that's humbling myself, because that other person, I can't control if they apologize or not. They might go, oh yeah, totally, that was all your fault, and thanks for apologizing. And for me, I'd be like, the old me would have been like, okay, well, listen up, you had a role to play too. And then I would try and control that person's response. And part of me giving up control of my life is to be humble in those situations, because afterwards I feel like $1,000,000 and I got no reason to go back to the drink. I have no reason to obsess about that person or that situation again. And I can move on with my life. And a lot of people don't understand that. They go, that was a wrong. You should I would hold on to that. I don't know if I could let go of that. Right. And I'm like, well, what's the point?
It's the most loving thing you could do, right?
Exactly. Because I'm going to live longer now. I'm going to be able to love other people better. I'm going to be able to go to bed and not worry about things. That's how I love myself out of my OCD sometimes, is that, if I forgive somebody or forgive myself, then I can easily move on. And I also know in my faith that I'm forgiven as well. So why wouldn't I forgive other people? Right? Like that's how I practice that.
Thank you so much for sharing all of this.
Welcome.
Your work is just so beautiful and so touching. Tell us where people can get a hold of you and, read your books.
I think the easiest way to get a hold of me is I'm pretty active on Instagram. My Instagram handle is _Poetry Bandit, or they can email me at thepoetrybandit@gmail.com. And my books are all on Amazon. So I've got 3 books out. The first one's called My Sober Little Moon. It's self-published. The second's called You Only Love Me When I'm Suffering. And that was my first published book with Macmillan. And then my third book is called Encyclopedia of a Broken Heart, which is sort of a follow-up to Suffering. And so those are the books that are out there. The 2 published ones, Suffering and Broken Heart, you can find in Target, in Barnes & Noble, some Books A Million. But yeah, the easiest place is always to pop on Amazon if you don't have a problem with online shopping.
No, I'm so grateful for the work that you do, really. And I'm really grateful for how open and how much you advocate for mental health. I think you bring a different voice to the conversation, which I think is really so great.
And I got to say thank you to you as well. You have no idea how many times I've popped open my feed in the middle of a spiral and seen something that you've posted that has helped me, or a video or a Q&A. And it's nice to know that I'm not the only one that has had issues with relationship OCD or intrusive thoughts or cyclical thinking, right? It's nice to know that there are lots of other people out there that struggle and that are turning to people like yourself for solutions. So thank you.
It's my pleasure, really. Really it is. It's beautiful work. And I think the truth is, I think social media has allowed us to understand that there are lots of people out there going through exactly what we're going through.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you.
Thanks, Kim.
Please note that this podcast or any other resources from cbtschool.com should not replace professional mental health care. If you feel you would benefit, please reach out to a provider in your area. Have a wonderful day, and thank you for supporting cbtschool.com.